There's a particular kind of person who shows up in almost every office, every friend group, every family. He's the one who remembers your coffee order, never raises his voice, picks up the slack when nobody else will, and apologizes first even when the disagreement wasn't really his fault. People call him such a nice guy. They mean it as a compliment. But somewhere in the back of his own mind, a quieter, more honest voice keeps asking why none of it seems to be working. Why the promotion went to someone louder. Why his patience gets read as weakness, his generosity gets read as an obligation, and his good intentions seem to evaporate the moment somebody else wants something from him. In 1513, a Florentine diplomat sat down, recently fired, recently humiliated, recently broke, and wrote a manual for people who wanted power but didn't yet have it. He called it the Prince. 500 years later, his name has become an insult Machiavellian, a byword for cunning and cruelty. But buried inside that reputation is something far more useful than most people give it credit for. A brutally honest diagnosis of why goodness, on its own, so often fails to protect the people who practice it. This video isn't an invitation to become cruel. It's an argument that being good and being effective are two separate skills, and that the nice guy's mistake isn't kindness, it's mistaking kindness for a complete strategy. Machiavelli never said be evil. He said, know the difference between how people ought to behave and how they actually do. And don't be the only person in the room operating on the wrong map. So if you've ever wondered why being agreeable hasn't made your life easier, stick around. We're going through 6 pieces of advice, all built from Machiavelli's writing, that explain exactly where nice guys go wrong and what to do about it without losing the thing that made you decent in the first place. Machiavelli's most famous, most misquoted idea is the choice between being loved and being feared. People remember it as it's better to be feared than loved, and stop there, which is exactly the wrong way to understand it. His actual point was narrower and far more useful. Ideally, you'd be both. But if you can only secure one reliably, fear, or more accurately, respect backed by consequences is the sturdier foundation, because love is a debt other people choose whether to honor, while respect built on real consequences is much harder for them to simply walk away from. The nice guy builds his entire social position on being loved. He's agreeable, easy to work with, never the source of friction. And for a while, this works beautifully until the moment his interests collide with someone else's. That's the actual test. Affection that hasn't been tested by conflict isn't loyalty. It's just the absence of a reason to leave yet. The coworker who happily dumps extra work on him isn't being cruel exactly. They're rationally exploiting the one resource in the room that appears to have no cost attached. There's no penalty for taking advantage of someone who has spent years training everyone around him to believe he'll absorb it. This is the part that stings. It's rarely that people dislike the nice guy. It's that liking him has never cost them anything, so it carries no real weight when a hard decision needs to be made. He has confused being well-liked with being secure, and those aren't the same currency. Being well-liked depends entirely on other people's continued goodwill. Being respected depends on the fact that consequences exist if that goodwill ever runs out. The fix isn't to become cold or punishing. It's to make sure that crossing him has a cost attached to it, even a small one, so that good behavior toward him is at least partly self-interested, not purely charitable. A boundary stated once and enforced is worth more than 100 boundaries stated and quietly dropped. The moment people learn that disrespecting him is free, they will keep cashing that in, not because they're villains, but because that's simply what happens to any resource with no price attached. Machiavelli describes the ideal ruler as needing the qualities of 2 animals at once. The fox, cunning enough to recognize traps, and the lion, strong enough to scare off wolves. Neither alone is sufficient. The lion who can't see a trap walks straight into it. The fox who can't intimidate anything gets eaten by something bigger the moment the cleverness runs out. Nice guys are almost always pure foxes with no lion in them at all, perceptive, sensitive to other people's moods, excellent at reading a room, but with nothing behind that perception that could make anyone think twice. They see exactly what's happening to them. They simply don't do anything that changes the outcome. Awareness without leverage is just a more articulate form of suffering. Here's the genuinely freeing part of this idea. Machiavelli isn't telling anyone to abandon perceptiveness in favor of brute aggression. He's pointing out that perceptiveness, without any deterrent attached to it, is wasted effort. There's no need to become someone who picks fights. There's only a need to become someone whose calm has a flaw under it, a point past, which the easygoing manner stops, and something firmer takes over, visibly enough that people learn where the flaw is without it needing to be announced every single time. This is also where Machiavelli's advice about appearances becomes genuinely useful. He argued that a ruler doesn't need to actually possess every virtue, only to appear to possess the ones that matter, while reserving the freedom to act differently when the situation truly demands it. Translated out of palace politics, There's no need to broadcast every boundary in advance, no need to deliver a speech about a new policy of not being a pushover. The lion just needs to show up occasionally, briefly, predictably, in direct response to something that actually crossed a line and then recede, leaving everything else exactly as warm and easy as it was before. People recalibrate fast. One demonstrated unwillingness to be steamrolled buys far more peace than 100 passive-aggressive sighs ever could. There's a chapter in The Prince that's almost uncomfortably relevant here, concerned with generosity. Machiavelli's argument is that a ruler who tries to maintain a reputation for limitless generosity will eventually exhaust his resources, be forced to extract more from everyone else to refill them, and end up resented by the very people he was trying to please, while the handful who directly benefited will never be grateful enough to offset the much larger number who now feel the cost. This maps almost perfectly onto the nice guy's emotional and practical economy. He says yes to everything, every favor, every extra shift, every friend who needs picking up at midnight, every project nobody else wants. For a while he is beloved for it. But generosity drawn entirely from a finite personal account, his time, his patience, his money, his emotional bandwidth, eventually runs dry. And when it does, two things happen. First, the people who relied on it experience the sudden absence as a betrayal rather than a reasonable limit, because they had quietly come to treat his generosity as the baseline rather than the exception. Second, he has nothing left for the people and causes he actually cares about most, because it all got spent on whoever happened to ask first. Machiavelli's actual prescription is worth sitting with. He suggests it's better to be known as careful, even slightly tight-fisted, with one's resources, because that reputation costs very little in how people behave toward you, while it preserves what you have for the moments that genuinely matter. A reputation for thoughtful limits is far cheaper to maintain than a reputation for limitless availability, because the first is sustainable and the second is a debt that compounds. Applied to an ordinary life, this doesn't mean stop being generous. It means stop being generous by default, indiscriminately, to whoever happens to ask loudest or first. Generosity that's never rationed eventually becomes invisible. The giver disappears entirely into the gift, taken for granted precisely because he never once said no. The nice guy who learns to say, "I can't this time," without 3 paragraphs of apology, isn't becoming less kind. He's becoming a sustainable source of kindness instead of a depleting one, and the people who actually matter to him get a better, more present version of him as a result. One of the most controversial pieces of advice Machiavelli ever gave concerned promises. A ruler should keep his word when it's convenient to do so, but circumstances change. And a leader who rigidly keeps every promise regardless of what's happened since making it will be exploited by anyone willing to act in bad faith. The world, he points out, is full of people who will happily make commitments they have no intention of honoring. A leader who treats his own word as sacred while assuming nothing about anyone else's is operating with one hand tied behind his back. This is uncomfortable advice and should be handled carefully, since there's an obvious failure mode where it becomes an excuse for dishonesty. But the underlying observation is worth separating from the cynicism around it. The nice guy tends to treat every commitment he's ever made explicit or merely implied as permanently binding, regardless of whether the other person upheld their side, regardless of whether the situation has changed completely, regardless of whether honoring it now actively harms him. He'll keep showing up for a friendship that's become entirely one-directional, because he said once years ago that he'd always be there. He'll keep absorbing a colleague's disrespect because backing out of a tacit agreement to be the easy one feels like breaking a promise, even though no explicit promise was ever made. Machiavelli's point, recast more gently. Obligations should respond to reality, not stay frozen at the moment they were first made. If someone he's been generous with has shown, repeatedly, that the relationship only flows one way, he isn't violating some moral law by adjusting how much he gives. The original goodwill was real. Its expiration doesn't retroactively make it fake. People, including very nice people, often act as though revising a commitment is a character flaw, when really it's just basic risk management applied to relationships. The version of him who agreed to something 6 months ago, before he knew how it would actually play out, isn't obligated to keep paying a price that version of him never actually signed up for. This might be the single most important idea in the entire book for a nice guy to absorb. Machiavelli draws a sharp distinction between being hated and being held in contempt, arguing that a ruler can survive being disliked, even hated, as long as he avoids contempt, because hatred without contempt still carries a kind of caution. People leave you alone because they take you seriously, even if they don't particularly like you. Contempt is different. Contempt means people have decided you carry no consequences at all, and once that belief sets in, you become a target not because anyone's especially angry at you, but simply because there's no cost to treating you badly. This is the exact trap most nice guys fall into without realizing it. They're so terrified of being disliked that they avoid every action that might generate friction, and in doing so, they remove the very signals that prevent contempt in the first place. Being disliked occasionally is not actually dangerous. What's dangerous is being so unfailingly accommodating that people stop factoring your feelings, your time, or your boundaries into their decisions at all. Nobody schemes against someone they respect, even reluctantly. They scheme against or simply walk over someone they've stopped taking seriously. Machiavelli's advice for avoiding contempt was specific. Avoid being seen as fickle, frivolous, indecisive, or weak. Be seen as someone whose word means something and whose reactions aren't random. The nice guy's instinct is often the opposite. He changes his stated opinion to match whoever he's talking to, agrees to plans he has no intention of following through on because saying no in the moment feels uncomfortable, and lets every disagreement get smoothed over instead of actually resolved. Every one of these habits, individually small, builds toward exactly the reputation Machiavelli warned against. Someone whose positions are negotiable, whose yes doesn't mean much, and whose feelings can be safely disregarded because he'll never actually do anything about it. The corrective isn't dramatic. It's consistency. Say less, but mean what you say. Decline more often, but follow through completely on what you do agree to. Let people occasionally be a little unsure how you'll react to something, not because you're moody, but because you have actual standards that occasionally produce friction. Predictable kindness with zero teeth invites contempt. Kindness with the occasional sharp edge does not. Toward the end of The Prince, Machiavelli compares fortune to a violent river that floods unpredictably, except, he notes, in places where people have built dams and levees in advance. Fortune, he argues, controls roughly half of what happens to us. The other half is left to human initiative, preparation, and the willingness to act decisively when the moment arrives rather than waiting passively for circumstances to resolve themselves on their own. He goes further, with an image that has aged badly in tone but holds an idea worth extracting on its own terms. He describes fortune as something that respects boldness more than caution, yielding more easily to people who confront it directly than to those who approach it tentatively, waiting for a permission that will never actually arrive. The nice guy's relationship to opportunity tends to be deeply passive. He waits to be noticed rather than putting himself forward. He waits for the right moment to ask for what he wants rather than creating that moment himself. He assumes that if he simply does excellent, quiet, dependable work for long enough, recognition will eventually arrive on its own, the way a fair universe is supposed to distribute rewards to people who deserve them. Machiavelli's entire body of work is, among other things, a 500-year-old rebuttal of that assumption. Recognition is not handed out for merit alone. It goes disproportionately to people who ask for it, position themselves for it, and act before the situation has fully resolved itself in their favor. This isn't a call to be reckless or to abandon patience entirely. It's a corrective to a specific kind of paralysis, the belief that taking initiative is somehow rude, or that asking directly for what you want is a form of aggression, when in practice it's simply how most outcomes actually get decided. The promotion goes to the person who asked for the project, not the one who silently hoped someone would eventually notice he could handle it. The relationship moves forward because someone said what they wanted, not because both people sat around waiting for the other to read their mind. Boldness, in Machiavelli's sense, isn't about volume or aggression. It's about being willing to act on incomplete information instead of waiting for a certainty that will never come. None of this is permission to become someone who manipulates, lies, or treats other people as obstacles. That's a misreading of Machiavelli that's been repeated so often it's become the entire popular understanding of his name, and it misses what he was actually doing. He wasn't writing a guide for villains. He was writing a guide for people who had already decided to be effective in a world that doesn't reliably reward goodness on its own, and who needed an honest account of how that world actually works, instead of a comforting one. The nice guy's real problem was never that he was too good. It's that he built his entire approach to other people around a single tool accommodation and used it indiscriminately, in every situation, with no calibration, no cost attached, and no fallback when it failed. Machiavelli's advice, stripped of its reputation, amounts to something fairly simple: have more than one tool. Be capable of warmth and capable of firmness. Be generous, but ration it deliberately rather than spending it on whoever asks first. Keep your commitments, but let them respond to reality instead of treating them as permanently fixed regardless of what happens. Avoid being hated needlessly, but never let yourself slide into being held in contempt, because contempt is by far the more dangerous condition. And don't wait passively for the world to notice your patience. Half of what happens to you is decided by what you're actually willing to go out and do about it. The goal was never to make the nice guy meaner. It was to make him harder to exploit, which, ironically, tends to make him a better friend, partner, and colleague, not a worse one, because the kindness he has left to give, once it's no longer being drained by people who never intended to reciprocate, can finally go to the people who deserve it. The fox sees the trap. The lion makes sure nobody bothers setting one in the first place. A person who is both isn't a different kind of person than the nice guy started out as. He's the same person, with the second half of the equation finally installed. Machiavelli wrote The Prince while sitting in exile, having lost the position, the income, and the respect he'd spent his career building, watching from the sidelines while people far less capable than him held the power he'd hoped to earn through quiet competence and loyal service. He understood the nice guy's position better than almost anyone who's ever written about power, because he lived it, and it cost him everything before he finally wrote down what he'd learned. The book wasn't bitterness, it was the most honest exit interview in the history of political writing. If there's one thing worth taking from 500 years of his reputation as the patron saint of ruthlessness, it's this: goodness with no defense built around it isn't virtue, it's just an unprotected resource, and the world will treat it exactly that way. The fix was never to stop being good. It was to stop being so easy to take from.